feel very honored to be allowed now to welcome Professor Achille Mbembe and to welcome Peggy Piesche to actually engage also in furthering the discussions about the universal right to breathe. And since we had some technical issues this noon and we could not share our opening with you all, please allow me to combine introducing our speakers and the festival's conceptual ideas, I promise, in less than 9 minutes. So once again, welcome to our festival that cares. It cares to say we care about racism, we care about sexism, we care about injustice, and we care not simply because we can, we care because we want to intervene into racism, sexism, injustice, on behalf of resistance, solidarity, and care. To me personally, this translates into acknowledging that I'm privileged at the cost of many. COVID-19 has taught me this. Because of holding a German passport, I'm so privileged at the cost of so many others. Black Lives Matter has made me aware once again, because of racism and its white supremacy, I'm so privileged as at the cost of so many others. Right, if you are white in the midst of white supremacy, privileges are at white people's disposal without any further ado. Privileges cannot be undone by simply wanting to, but they can be faced, acknowledged, and shared in empathy, solidarity, and care. To make oneself aware of one's very own privileges, to address them and work on sharing them, is a powerful agency in the midst of privileges. Yet for way too many white people, privileged whiteness feels so normal and right that they consider it their right to be better off than others. Century-old racist paradigms of white superiority designed to justify white people's sense of entitlement to comfortable lives beyond crisis still inhere in the narrative of Africa as being in permanent crisis. For many, this constellation comes so naturally that they truly forget about this. The European enslavement of Africans and colonialism have stolen labor, lives, and resources from Africa, making Europe and the US prosper in the process. It was stolen labor, stolen resources, and stolen futures that built the Industrial Revolution in the West. And it was this very stealing that destroyed social, economic, political, and cultural structures in Africa. And contemporary neoliberal agents of globalization continue to do so. No, neither privileges nor crises are ever naturally given. They are human-made, just as their very agent, social inequality. This is, of course, not without any alternative, but so far, no societal order ever practiced any alternative to building upon the principle of privileging some at the cost of discriminating others. This is an ongoing pain and crisis that is hardly felt by those who cause it. Ever since 1949, Germany has lived beyond crisis, and it got so used to it that in 2015-16, they started to invent a crisis when confronted with some people seeking shelter from war, polluted soils, and poverty. What had happened? The number of people seeking for asylum in Germany had tripled for about 12 months. This was not even 1% of people being forced into flight on this planet, and yet Europe complained the loudest, while turning things upside down. While imagining the West in crisis, it downplayed existing crises, the war in Syria, oil pollution, change, etc., and they ignored the respective responsibility of the West. Ultimately, the debate about refugee crisis was all about the rhetorical question: to whom should Germany, its belonging, resources, and futures belong? And the answer to this rhetorical question was whiteness. It was the big elephant in the room. In other words, the so-called refugee crisis was rather an identity crisis, an identity crisis of a society that keeps insisting on white privileges that do not care about those who pay the bills. White people keep white spaces white. Now, however, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed the White West into a real crisis together with the rest of the world. Yet, the White West is not only at crisis because there are so many that are critically ill and dying. For many whites in the West, this is their first time realizing that the privileged, accustomed white happy land, as described by Tupoka Ogette, can be forced out of its comfort zone. There's a shock going around that COVID-19 is indeed not a glossy magazine cover crisis. The consternation has a lot to do with the fact that people in the White West have grown habituated to being better off than billions of other people. Moreover, they also perceive it to be their very right. But now, something has happened that has stirred up discussion bursting with privileges. COVID-19 has stirred up the white illusion of always being able to sit on the bright side of life, making it burst like a soap bubble. That is why the coronavirus pandemic is to whiteness essentially also an, oh my God, it can happen to me crisis. Privilege pampered and power driven, Germany keeps investing a lot of energy to still being the privileged ones. After all, COVID-19 may not discriminate according to age, origin, passport type, gender, or via racism, but human answers to the virus do. While the white global north can afford a shutdown and social distancing way better than people of color, both in the global north and south, white supremacy keeps granting white people a privileged access to medical care at the cost of depriving people of color thereof. Let's just think of French virologists suggesting to test their medication in Africa once again. Let's just think of Lesbos, Moria, and the housing of refugees in Germany. Forced to cram together, they have no chance of practicing social distancing or equal medical treatment. Caring not to care about this, white Germany even keeps insisting that it was right to be better off than others. White people keep white spaces safe, and they are eager to keep all places white at that. Right now, the privileged ones are back to traveling across the planet, eager to sunbath, yet not caring about spreading the virus, really? Once again, in the midst of white ignorance about all of this, another white policeman has killed another person of color. Unfortunately, George Floyd was only one of very, very many. In the US, in Germany, everywhere. Deep down in the globe's history and present, racism has never stopped killing on a daily basis. And while many white people are seemingly surprised that such a racist murder may indeed happen, and there's something called racism all around, they still wonder why it needs to be stressed that Black Lives Matter. And while way more white people are upset about racism being addressed and reproached loudly than about racism itself, they still wonder why it needs to be stressed that Black Lives Matter. And by explaining racism away again and again, they still wonder why it needs to be stressed that Black Lives Matter. All lives matter, I hear them say, yes, of course they do, but they don't. All lives should matter evenly, but they don't. Racism is all about white supremacy and its principle of dehumanizing people of color. This systematic white strategy has been affecting people of color all around the globe. Therefore, it needs to be stressed. Black Lives Matter. And it needs to be stressed in all of its facets, be it anti-Black racism, be it anti-Semitism, be it Orientalist racism, be it in the US, be it in Germany, be it in Israel. That is what will be done tonight. Thanks to our keynote speaker, Professor Achille Mbembe, who will talk about the universal right to breathe and the racist violation thereof. Achille Mbembe is one of the world's most prolific and renowned contemporary intellectuals. Trained in history and political sciences, he has authored 9 monographs and numerous articles, and he edited many further books, thus becoming an intellectual trendsetter in postcolonial thinking and in criticizing violence, social inequality, racism, and discrimination in general. Since 2001, Achille Mbembe has been professor at the Wits University for Social and Economic Research, Johannesburg. He has won numerous awards, lately the Gerda-Henkel-Preis and the Albertus-Magnus-professorship. In the last month, though, he was facing a violent accusation in Germany. He was called anti-Semitic. Why? Because he dared to address the racist discrimination of Palestinians in Israel. Yet, yes, and this is still a no-go in Germany, because to many, to criticize the racist discrimination of Palestinians in Israel comes close to questioning the right of the existence of the state of Israel, which then in turn is interpreted as questioning the Holocaust and its legacy. A vicious circle that ends up in silencing the structural racism towards Palestinians in Israel. Yes, right. The constellation in Israel-Palestine are challenging and complex. Yes, right. There are very good reasons for Germany to be full of humility towards Jewish people and towards Israel. The Holocaust is a legacy that matters indeed. Yet this legacy should not be about silencing racism, be it white policemen killing a person of color in the US or Israel. To the contrary, this legacy should be about not treating Israel differently from the US. Isn't anti-Semitism exactly about this? Germany's othering of Jews and Israel? This is one of the questions we address today in Professor Mbembe's speech, and this speech will be commented on by Peggy Piesche. Peggy Piesche has been a pioneer in addressing racism in Germany, a scholar, activist, and thinker who made all the difference in Germany. That Germany starts talking about its racism today more openly than ever. After all, this is mainly a result of Peggy Piesche's ongoing academic and activistic work of addressing racism, sharing respective knowledge, and caring for solidarity and empathy. She's been an icon of subverting white supremacy, indeed. She has worked at numerous universities in the US and Germany, has published numerous books and articles on racism, critical whiteness, and intersectionality, and initiated numerous initiatives, lately the change of the term race into racism in Berlin's anti-discrimination law. Since 2019, she's working at the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung in Berlin. As I said, she will comment on Professor Achille Mbembe's talk, yet the talk, of course, comes first in the very urgency of the now at the very right time. Please help me welcome Professor Achille Mbembe and his talk, The Universal Right to Breathe, Colonialism and the Ethics of Memory.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to thank Susan for her introduction. And I would also like to thank all of those who have made sure that we gather here tonight, if only virtually. I hope that we will all get out of this wiser than a few minutes ago. There is no doubt our world is in turmoil, if not in disarray. Many have been trying to describe the era in which we find ourselves. Very insecure moment that seems to promise almost nothing. In a world which is dominated ever more by what we could call the specter of its own demise. We can disagree, of course, about many things, but it will be difficult, it seems to me, not to agree about the fact that this is a time defined by an unequal redistribution of vulnerability. It is also a time that is characterized, I would suggest, by new compromises with forms of violence simultaneously archaic and futuristic. And the name of Floyd has been mentioned, rightfully so, at the beginning of this evening. His murder on a pavement in a major US city is precisely that kind of, that form of violence I characterize as both archaic and futuristic. And as we gather here tonight, some nations are talking about post-COVID-19. And why not? Why should they not? But for most of us, especially those in parts of the world where healthcare systems have been devastated by years of organized neglect, the worst is still to come. And with no hospitals beds, with no respirators, no mass testing, no masks, no disinfectants, or arrangements for placing those who are infected in quarantine. For those of us living here then, unfortunately, many are they who will not pass through the eye of the needle. In a book I published in February of this year called Brutalism, I characterize the current era as brutalist. I build on its origins in a mid-20th century architectural movement to define brutalism as a contemporary process whereby power increasingly expresses itself, reproduces itself as a geomorphic force. How so? Through processes that include fracturing, emptying, drilling, and expelling organic matter, in a word, by what I term depletion. That part of the function of power today is to make us tired, to deplete our energies, both physical, mental, and psychic. It seems to me indeed that powers in their various forms increasingly evidence both molecular, chemical, and radioactive and toxic dimensions. Toxic in the sense that they operate as substances that not only attack nature and the environment, the air, the soil, water, the food chains, but substances which are also harmful to the living bodies exposed to physical exhaustion and to all sorts of invisible biological dangers. And among these constellations of powers are, of course, viruses, of which we are told they are nearly 600,000, carried by all kinds of mammals. Now, before we go further, it might be useful to remind ourselves of the COVID-19's ways of killing. What it does is that it breaks the barrier of the victim's pulmonary alveoli. It breaches them. The virus then infiltrates their bloodstream. Then it attacks organs and other tissues, starting with the most vulnerable. What follows is a systematic inflammation, and those who, prior to the attack, already had cardiovascular, neurological, or metabolic problems, or were suffering from pollution-related pathologies, are the hardest hit. Breathless and with no respirators, some slip away all of a sudden, and immediately their remains are buried or cremated. We get rid of them as quickly as possible. While we are at it, let's add to those we have lost all those others, tens of millions in fact, all the victims of HIV/AIDS, the victims of cholera, the victims of malaria, of Ebola, of Nipah and Lassa fever, yellow fever, Zika, chikungunya, cancers of all kinds, epizootic and other animal pandemics, such as swine fever and blue tongue, or all sorts, in fact, of imaginable and unimaginable epidemics. Epidemics that for centuries have ravaged faceless people in distant lands, to say nothing of the bombing or the predatory wars and occupations that mutilate and decimate tens of thousands, so many more onto the roads of exodus, a kind of humanity set adrift. And let's not forget intensive deforestation, the mega fires, the destruction of ecosystems, the pernicious activities of companies that pollute and destroy biodiversity. How could we, since henceforth confinement is part and parcel of our condition, how could we forget the masses crowding prisons all over the world, those whose lives are fractured when they come up against walls and other borders, whether it is the innumerable checkpoints across the land or seas, oceans, deserts, and the rest. I mention all of this to draw our attention on the issue I started with. It's time set adrift, of which the COVID-19 and its capacity to cripple our respiratory functions, what it is the symbol of. But let me add that in fact, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the West, nearly 85% of the wetlands have been drained. As the destruction of habitats continues unabated, human populations with vulnerable health conditions are exposed to new pathogens almost on a daily basis. Before colonization, the wild animals that harbor most pathogens were confined to places in which only isolated populations lived. Such was the case, for instance, here in South Africa where I live. That was also the case in other places in the continent. That was the case, I would add, in the Congo River Basin, for instance. I mentioned the Congo River Basin because it is the example of the world's last forested country today. Nowadays, the communities that lived and dependent on natural resources in these areas have been expropriated, driven away from homes by tyrannical and corrupt regimes that sell off the land and grant giant concessions to agro-food consortiums. They are no longer able to maintain the forms of food and energy self-sufficiency that for centuries allowed them to live in balance with nature. I mention all of that to suggest that, in fact, the case has been pressed already 1,000 times. We can almost recite the charges eyes shut. And since the dangers faced by humanity are increasingly existential, let me nevertheless go once again through some of these. The first concerns, of course, the status and position of the human species within the vastness of the universe. We are not the only inhabitants of the earth, nor are we set above other things or other beings. We are crisscrossed by fundamental interactions with microbes and viruses and all sorts of vegetal, mineral, and organic forces. More accurately, we are partly composed of these other beings, but they also decompose and recompose us. They make and they unmake us, starting with our bodies, our environments, our ways of living, and our ways of dying. The pandemic has revealed not just the complexity and fragility of the structure and content of human civilizations, but the vulnerability of life itself in all its anarchy and diversity, from the bodies that house it and the breath that diffuses it, to the nourishment without which it would wither away. This fundamental vulnerability is the very essence of humanity, but it is shared to varying degrees by every creature on this planet, a planet that powerful forces threaten to render inhospitable, if not uninhabitable, to the majority of living beings. But the pandemic has also laid bare the disorder, the violence, and injustice that structure the world at large. Because despite scattered progress, the perpetual peace that Immanuel Kant hoped for remains a mirage for most people. Now, as ever, the sovereignty and independence of countless nations are ultimately protected and guaranteed by war. In other words, the possibility of the disproportionate spilling of blood, since that is what war is all about. The establishment of an international system of solidarity with a power structure that transcends national sovereignties is still a long way off. At the same time, the idea of a return to autarkic empires is nothing more than a fantasy. Meanwhile, a whole constellation of forces that are as much physical or natural as they are organic or mechanical, including technology, the media, and the financial markets, these forces are busy weaving a lattice of fractures between every part of the world. A planetary chain that ignores and paradoxically relies on state borders and has no relation to official cartographies is currently gaining shape and strength. Made up of intertwinings and interdependencies, it is not the same as what has been known as globalization, at least in the sense of the term since the fall of the Soviet Union. It is rather an exploded whole, networks, flows, and circuits that constantly dissolve and reform at varying speeds and on multiple scales. This whole emerges out of many different entanglements, not least between inhabited areas and wildernesses and their respective boundaries. The weave of the world is composed of numerous extremes and a multitude of large and small nuclei. Nothing is outside it. Everything serves at one point or another as a relay in the rapid circulation of all types of flow. Of course, not everything moves to the same rhythm, but planetary existence in all its manifestations is now ruled by motion and speed. It is not just capital flows that move. Humans, animals, pathogens, and objects are also mobile, as are all sorts of goods, data, and information. Raw materials are extracted in one place and refined in another. Components are assembled into goods somewhere else again and again. As discontinuous as they seem, the pathways things follow are often the same, moving from the crudest tangibility to the most ethereal abstraction. So what we are witnessing is the development of planetary complexes which operate at various scales and across networks which are more or less spatially fragmented. So it seems to me that part of what COVID-19 has exposed is this new map of the world, for which, as you may have followed, we lack the proper vocabulary or categories to describe. But such is the world before us, which we have to inhabit, which is becoming, as I'm arguing, more and more planetary. COVID has exposed also one of the tragic underpinnings of any political order, and without doubt, the one that we are most inclined to forget. What is it? Is that to guarantee the continuity of the political community, lives may need to be sacrificed. The question is, which lives? And sacrificed by whom, when, why, and under what conditions? Indeed, there is no human community that does not have at its foundation a concept of forbidden blood, blood that can only be spilled in certain circumstances. Whether united by origin, religion, or race, all communities are collections of profoundly dissimilar people. The blood prohibition is like a protective spell against internal conflict. It allows members of the community to coexist without killing each other. Ultimately, what distinguishes one human community from another is how it responds when its existence is threatened. In other words, how it tackles the conundrum of which lives should be discarded to ensure that the life of the community at large does not stop altogether. Is there any way to perform such a sacrifice that does not lead to either the escalation of internal disputes or the dissolution of social ties and the total eradication of the political unit? Such is a question political communities throughout history have faced and are facing anew. In the not so distant past, epidemics and famines made this dilemma one of the most important sovereign decisions. Wars were the archetype of these historic events that required the sacrifice of some lives so that others could continue or even flourish. Cataclysmic conflicts demanded the ruthless use of force. The aim was to kill enemies, accused, of course, of threatening the community's ongoing existence. But war being what it is, pursuing an enemy meant risking being attacked in return. What has happened is that from the 19th century onwards, the enumeration and weighing of life, and thus the redistribution of sacrificial possibilities, was primarily a matter of economics. It became a matter of economics. Economics nowadays decides, so to say, who must live and who must be sacrificed. Nowadays, lives are not weighed against the moral obligation attendant upon an individual's place in society. They are weighed according to a series of calculations. These calculations all follow from a single fact or single faith, a single creed, the creed according to which, at least we are being told, society no longer has any autonomy as such. It has become a mere appendage to the market. So in other words, the market decides who must live and who must be sacrificed. This is both the great dogma and the great wager of the present day. According to the terms of the wager, the gains and profits acquired through trade or sometimes through conquest always outflank any other human motive. There's no gain other than that derived from the sale of some item. Life, in other words, is governed by market prices. That is what we are led to believe. That is what, in other words, neoliberalism, quote unquote, is all about. Neoliberalism teaches us that every human life is a probability, and the calculation of lives resembles the calculation of probabilities. In this calculation, the only thing that counts is efficiency. Life exists only to the extent that it can be spent. To guarantee the survival of the many, we are told, we must agree to jettison the lives of the few. Now, as the Anthropocene marks our passage into a new viral and pathogenic age, the question is how to identify which bodies might contaminate the community and which lives must be offloaded in order to ensure the survival of the many. And it is in that context that the question of the right to exist and the right to a future are posed. And I would now like to say a few words about that right to exist and that right to a future, as indeed they relate to the question of the right to breathe. As we all know, the most serious problem we are facing today is global warming caused by humanity's emission of greenhouse gases. These are the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane in particular, not to mention, of course, the ultrafine dust, toxic emissions, invisible substances, fine granules, and all sorts of particulate matter. In fact, soon there will be more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than oxygen. In Africa specifically, the greatest concern is the depletion of fish stocks, the degradation of mangrove swamps, the increasing levels of nitrate pollution, and the deterioration of coastal zones. It is also the sell-off of forests, the excessive use of agrochemicals, human encroachment onto natural land, the loss of rare species, in short, the destruction of the biosphere. None of this is the result of chance. On the contrary, it is the inevitable outcome of the extraction and squandering of the Earth's resources, a paradigm that can be maintained only by the constant and uninterrupted combustion of fossil fuels in a planet-wide technological and industrial network. Humanity will not survive if we continue to rely on the continuous consumption of vast quantities of energy that must be sourced from ever deeper inside the bowels of the earth. The current state of the earth means that events like COVID-19 are likely to happen again in the relatively near future. Thanks to the industrialization of meat markets, the intensification of relationships between humans and other species, the expansion of monoculture, and the climate catastrophe, we are facing the imminent risk of new pandemics. Because any of these could ultimately result in our demise, each will provoke intense fear, accompanied by bursts of irrationality. The question of the right to exist, the right to breathe, and the right to a future will become ever more pressing. As far as the right to exist is concerned, this right will be increasingly inseparable from its opposite, the hunt for carriers of infectious germs. In other words, the identification of who to sacrifice for the sake of everyone else's survival. The great danger is that these apparently health-based decisions will end jeopardizing the lives of the undesirables. This risk is inherent both in the novel economic forms now emerging and in the techniques of government made possible by the pandemic. Necessary as they are, the technologies deployed during the crisis do not in themselves eliminate the danger. On the contrary, it would be easy to involve health reasons to justify their use against any human being deemed to be a biological risk. Many sovereign functions properly performed by state agencies are already being outsourced, particularly to giant corporations and technology companies in sections like artificial intelligence, quantum science, hypersonic speed, and technologies for localization, capture, and tracing. This raises numerous questions with no satisfying answers, at least for the moment. If reality can now only be described or represented using numbers and abstract codes, and if codes and numbers seem increasingly to be taking on dimensions of a cosmogony, how can we ensure that the logic behind the counting and weighing of lives does not become a logic of elimination and erasure? In this era of unbounded calculation, are we dealing with absolute certainties or probabilities, and hence wagers? What does immunity mean if measuring the risk is the same thing as quantifying the chance? How can we recognize the signs of a state turning against its own population instead of protecting society? So it seems to me that these questions have become almost unavoidable. We cannot avoid them any longer. Let me end then with the direct question of the right to breathe. It seems to me that even in normal times, equality before death is a myth. The right to exist is meaningless unless it is accompanied by its corollary, the right to subsist. Food can only be acquired by leaving the house under conditions so typical of urban life in most parts of the South. To obtain food, for instance, many must travel long distances. They have to rely on increasing prices for transport, interminable journeys on foot, all sorts of permits and authorizations. The hunt for food is an endless cycle of walking, of hustling, of haggling, bargaining, moving on, using all means possible, even illegal means. By this, I mean that the ability to move freely and to travel around is a prerequisite for access to food and provisions. So is the ability to plug into networks of social solidarity, to diversify allegiances and affiliations, to convert temporary arrangements into the resources required for permanence. Physical encounters, gatherings of people in close proximity, direct contact with other humans, even overcrowding, without these, the daily battle to survive would be lost before it began. It is won not in isolation, but by people coming together. In these circumstances, forced immobility is not just a form of punishment, it is also a way to expose a significant proportion of the population to enormous danger. The poorest members of society, who have no safety net and nobody to take care of them, can now no longer even take care of themselves. Under lockdown, the most vulnerable people are confronted by a still more dramatic choice: obey the instruction to stay at home, respect the law, and starve to death, or defy the law, go outside, and risk catching the disease, or even more dramatically, spreading it. Such is the experience many African countries who have chosen confinement as a way of confronting the pandemic. So, such are some of the dramas they have faced recently. So from a market perspective, the right to exist and the right to subsist are entirely dependent on financial speculation and so fluctuation. Just like food, a living must be earned, and nobody can earn one by being idle. One way to earn a living is to work for a salary, and in practical terms, the right to life is reserved for those who obtain it through a salaried job or work. The fact remains, however, that many people simply cannot find paid employment. Their bread and butter must be cobbled together under conditions of hazard and uncertainty. So what COVID-19 has done is that it has exposed various types of human and social degradation and economic subjection. In the age of digital capitalism, there is no guarantee that labor power offered for sale will be bought. Work still has a market value, but there is less and less paid employment to go around. This is particularly true where the virus is affecting societies that were already vulnerable, in the process of disintegration or suffering under the yoke of tyranny. In these parts of the world, government by neglect and omission is the rule. These are the sites of the most brutal experiments, including medical ones, at the intersection of life and non-life. The market economy in such areas is oriented around wastage and disposal. In this context, sacrifice does not necessarily mean gratuitous murder. Deep down, there's nothing sacred about it. It is not intended to win the favor of some divinity. It requires people to present themselves for counting, tallies to be performed, measurements to be made, and lives to be weighed, with those deemed not to count discarded. So these policies of disposal seem to be part of the normal order of things, so self-evident as to need no further thought. The question now is when the decision will be taken. When will we decide that such a sacrifice is socially unacceptable? When will we come back to the idea that it is life that is invaluable and thus fundamentally beyond the reach of any form of measurement? When will we come back to the idea that life cannot be counted? It is simply incalculable. I would like to leave you with those questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Many heartfelt thanks. Listening to this talk is both at the same time, so you have a way of addressing the devastating moments that show us that some futures simply devour others, and that some live at the cost of others. And it seems so unavoidable, and it's so avoidable listening to you. So therefore, I felt like listening to you was really entering an alternate future, and the possibility was out there in your talk. So thank you very much for that mind-blowing talk. And without further ado, I wish to pass on the word to dear Peggy Piesche as a comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Susan, and hello, everybody. Thank you for being here at this late hour. Thank you, Achille, for your wise words. As always, you are making a bridge, an umbrella over the whole world philosophy, so I have to see how I can catch in there. Yeah, I want to thank Susan and the team for inviting me, Katharina and everybody else. It's really good to see you again. And it always feels like a little field trip coming back to Bayreuth. Also, this is today only virtual. Yeah, Achille, you ended with, you left us with a question, which is of course, or questions which will of course stay with us and which are not that easy to answer. I'm trying to go out on a limb here to suggest an answer. When will we finally be able to recognize the value of life? And I would say, well, we would be on a good path if we could achieve something like universal empathy. Empathy, collective empathy. That's basically what we saw over the last couple of months, which is tremendously missing and has a tremendous impact. I want to make 3 points, and with these 3 points and remarks, I want to bring back your conversation a little bit more, or tie it more to Germany, and with some practical remarks over the last months. So my first thought would be along your lines, what the virus unearths about us. My second part will be the crisis of perception or confusion of public discourse. And my third part will be some thoughts about future, of course, and also to go out on a positive note. Yeah, what does the virus unearth about us? And I want to start with, well, it's actually also very interesting. It's an interesting virus itself. Of course, we are learning on every day about it, but it's interesting the connection about the scientific knowledge which comes out by the studies are being done, and also by the calculations of the deaths, we have to say. And the connection with how we actually publicly discuss that. We know that there's a slight, and not actually so slight, a possibility that men are more affected than women, that it has something to do, at least somehow, with an Y chromosome. So, and that shifts already something. Here we have a pandemic where the most vulnerable are starting to be banned. We are not prepared in the public discourse to actually talk about that. So that is a really interesting observation over the last month, because it shows the lack and of how we can actually deal with what comes to us. Also, what, who are we focusing on in a sense of the crisis management, and who was on the focus and who was not? And we, of course, discovered that over the last couple of months here in Germany as well, like everywhere else, that of course the people who were disenfranchised before were now even more disenfranchised. First, of course, and you already lined it out in the context of the economic challenges and the economic earthquake, so to speak, but also in terms of the invisibility which they didn't embody, but which the public view actually encountered, that the disenfranchised communities with regards to education, with regards to care work, and with regards to the digitalization, where people were not even being connected in thousands of miles, even we are living close together. So that is basically what this virus unearthed, so to speak. It also unearthed in that it connects. I mean, we are now having, we dealt with it in a span of several months, about the possibility and the impossibilities of participation in public spaces. While public spaces in the beginning of the pandemic rushed into the digital spaces, that's where we already saw that also a lot of people could not participate, and they had no public spaces whatsoever, because they couldn't go out and you didn't have access to the digital spaces. And now, after the reopening of states and areas, we see how the shift of public spaces is also being tremendously filled with again, danger and violence. We see it in the US, and of course with the infamous murder of George Floyd. But we also see it in Germany with an increasing taking up of this public space of the new kind of a new movement of conspiracy myth followers. So I want to be brief, that we also have some time for discussion. So let me quickly move on to my second thought and observation, the crisis of perception, or the confusion of this public discourse. So basically it ties into the first thought, and along this line, what this pandemic brought to light. We see how almost helpless or speechless, and literally without a language the West is dealing with, for example, Cuba's expertise, medical expertise. You have to have some other sources of communication and journalism other than the just average Western journalism in order to actually get this news that how much Cuba was on spot and how much Cuba was willing and able to help in solidarity, not only with Italy, but also with China, for example. We have no words for that. Why is that? Why is this so impossible to basically see and not only to recognize and to acknowledge, but actually feel a mutual understanding that we are all in the same boat, and here is somebody who at least seems to have a compass and actually also developed already a map. Why can't we do that? You know, and I think it ties into that where I went out on a limb, this empathy. We do not have empathy for the other. So the other is impossible, can't impossible do something and achieve something which we can't. And that is also what we see with regards to the reporting or the perception of the continent of Africa, how countries and societies dealt with the pandemic over there. So while of course we, especially in the diaspora, we hold our breath and our hearts, and if we are religious, pray, or and certainly connect with our ancestors, that the pandemic will not strike Africa as hard. We really have to say it is shocking to see how speechless again the West is to look in the good crisis management and the parts where societies, and certainly in the beginning, could take measures and actions because they have a lot of experience there. And here we have, again, expertise. It can't impossible be expertise on the continent. So what we see is that actually on the other side now, that especially in Germany, we are starting to link back to the old narrative of a vulnerable continent and societies in scarcity and with no health care system and all the absentees. And that's where we find language back. So we can talk about how dangerous it is. And of course it is dangerous, but there's something else too. And as long as we are not able to find a language to connect that as well, we will not be able to actually have a real global conversation on a global pandemic. So, and of course that the same patterns of language and perception and the same void of perception or language we see with regards to the public spaces and the increasing violence, what we see in the US and also how it is being commented here, and also in Germany as well. So I was very intrigued by your title, Achille, Universal Rights to Breathe. I think you did not really answer it directly, but I think after you broke down basically the failure of the Western philosophy, we are safe to answer that no, there is no such thing than a universal rights to breathe. At least we understand breathing in a different way when we connect it again with different forms of empathy. So when we see that it is apparently humanely possible to be on camera live and squeezing out the life of another human body, that already actually should take literally the breath, and it did for especially a lot of racialized communities and collectives, because we have this trauma embodied in us. It is, again, in another way, or if you can even top that, very shocking to see how white supremacist groups mock this man's last words, and also other murdered people's last words, "I can't breathe," for protests, actions, or rallies on anti-mask, not to wear mask, or the conspiracy myth going around, what we see here in Germany as well. So we had demonstrations in Berlin over the last couple of months, several times, that people held images of enslaved people. So white people demonstrated, protested the measures against the pandemic, for example, to stay at home, the lockdown, and to wear masks. And they held they showed images of enslaved people to distance themselves from that, to say, so they should not wear masks because they are free people. This is such an enormous lack of collective empathy. I don't even know where to start with that. So yeah, the universal rights of breath and breathing would mean to develop a collective empathy to understand what that actually means for another human being. On this very traumatic note, I really want to move on quickly to my third thought, and to some envisioning, and that would be the question of futures, and what can we look at, and what are we at right now. And that is where my political optimism is kicking in again, because just, as I think that the ancestors in me, the collective resilience, what we have for centuries. So we are now having a really good momentum in Germany, and I think we need to be very responsible with this momentum, and we need to deal with that with respect, because communities were fighting for that hard, and literally people were dying for it. So when we are now having a global attention, and we know how little the attention span it is, that is because of the several murders over the last couple of months during this pandemic. And you already talked about that it is, of course, not only George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and others. So we do have a momentum, we have an opening, we have a window, a short little window, and we need to use that. And with regard to Germany, it is fighting structural racism in Germany. It is, at least in my lifespan, I feel like it's for the first time that we actually have something like a recognition that we are dealing with structural racism here in Germany, that it is not about some intentional actions of some individuals, but that we are talking about structural racism. So, and that is something we need to hold on, and we need not to go back, not an inch going back on that. That also includes to point out and to hold these feet to the fire, who are trying to be in a transnational, I don't know what it is. It's not a dialogue, it's not an understanding, it is kind of a transnational distances or something, what we see from various politicians right now or public speakers, where we see where the white German self-understanding is with regards to the problem of structural racism. When we hear thoughts like, well, it's not like in the US. So we can't talk about racial profiling in Germany because it's not like in the US. So that's, again, tying it back to empathy, requires immediately to ask this kind of arguments. People who are coming up with this kind of arguments is, so how much racism is then acceptable for you in Germany? If it is, if it is fine, that it is not that bad as in the US, It might be arguable not that bad as in the US, but how much is then fine, And who decides about that to be fine? So that's to tie that back to say, put some empathy on it, If we have this opening window here right now that we're talking about structural racism, so let's do that and have an honest conversation. So we see that with, the Black Lives Matter movement in Germany brings this conversation to the foreground, and the political Black and POC communities, they're pushing for that. They're pushing in the public discourse, but also in politics. So we have some kind of a caucus of the government on extremism and racism, with no real representation and participation of the Black community. How you're talking about racism in Germany without the people who can actually tell you something about, not just of their own personal experience, but their collective experience. So, and the last point where I think that we are in a good momentum here right now is, and that ties into the second part of your title, the ethics of memory. We see it everywhere, when everywhere except in Germany, we have to say, around the globe, that the statues of colonialism, the statues of structural racism are being taken down, I think that's a beautiful moment. We need to find to find this momentum here in Germany as well. So what happens with all the statues of von Trotha's, the mass murderer of the Hereros and the Namas, or the Wismans of these times here? We have them; they're still around. So it needs to be taken action on that. But again, we have a good window, because what we see now also, what is unearthing, and that brings me to the end round to my first thought. So what this pandemic really unearths is the mud of structural racism, the mud of white supremacy, and the mud of the violence. But it brings also, it also unearths exactly what these traumatic expressions of power did to the power structure and to whiteness. It left it with a lack of empathy, a lack of language, and also a lack of imagination of something other than this kind of colonial history, because this is where we are right now in our discussion. And I find that tremendously interesting and also helpful, because now we see what is in their heads, like that we need the statues, otherwise we can't remember history. That is, it would be funny if it wouldn't be so painful to see how we hold on that, and that we can't imagine another future. What I just put in the sentence is to say, as society and as the hegemonic discourse of a society, because, and that is the happy note at the end, the collective power of resistance and resilience, and what we see being in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement globally shows us that we can imagine, envision, and also forming, creating other futures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Peggy, for sharing such a wide array of thoughts and criticism and visions. I think there are a lot, you named it. What are the next steps? They are out there. Let's go it. So thank you very much. Do you want to reply, Prof?
No, I would like to thank Peggy for a beautiful intervention. Just for those who are listening to us, Peggy didn't have access to the text. She listened to it and she responded on her feet, and she did it really brilliantly. And so I thank her for that. She did it while pushing it to a place I didn't go. But I'm very happy to follow her there. I agree with her about the fact that there is a window of opportunity that we do have here, not only in Germany, but I would say, if not everywhere, at least in those historical matrices of racism. I see 4 of them: the United States of America, of course, the Caribbean, Brazil, and South Africa. These are the places somewhat where models of modern racism have been fundamentally shaped. And I see a window of opportunity too in the recognition that racism does exist. Because until recently, some people still don't believe that it exists. Some people still deny it. Well, I say people means systematic denial. So it's a bit more complicated now to peddle the fable that it doesn't exist. Second, it exists, and as Peggy put it, it's not an accident. It's not accidental at all. It is systemic in the sense that it is structural, it is part of an ecosystem. And I want to use that term ecosystem purposefully, especially in the context I have described maybe too quickly, a context in which the biggest threat to our human existence on Earth right now is the possibility of being expropriated from our capacity to breathe. For me, to a large extent, that is part of what is at stake in the ongoing struggles for climate justice, for reconnecting in some form of biosymbiosis, the different forms of living we do share, we humans, with other inhabitants of the Earth. And the fact that racism is back on the global agenda, I don't know how long it will be there, but for the time being, it is back on the global agenda at the same time as the question of the sustainability of the Earth allows us to see to what extent these two struggles can converge. That we can rethink struggles for climatic justice, for the sustainability of the earth, as deeply connected with struggles against racism. That we cannot fight to repair the earth and give it durability if simultaneously we do not fight against racism. I really see a theoretical opening there, but also a political opening, which we can harness in a fruitful manner. The last thing, Peggy called it human empathy, and she's absolutely right. It's what seems to me to be the gradual emergence, not of a new form of universalism, some of those old words, but of hopefully a new form of planetary consciousness. And I call it planetary consciousness once again, purposefully, once again as in an effort to connect all these struggles together and give them what Peggy was calling a vocabulary, a name, because that is part of the effort too. So let me just leave it at that and thank Peggy once again for what was really a contribution. It was not just a comment, it was a contribution in its own terms.
Yeah, I don't know whether anyone in the room wants to join the discussion at this point. We also have some questions from Facebook and YouTube. Yeah, Christine.
Greetings, Professor Mbembe. It is my pleasure to see you again. This is for the second time in my life. It is a pleasure to hear you speak. Peggy, dear, it was lovely to hear you speak as well. I see I have much to learn, and it is a fantastic moment. Prof, can I just ask, you just mentioned how you saw the necessity of connecting climatic struggles to the struggle against racism. And you just said that you see a theoretical opening, but also a political opening. May I ask, Prof, do you distinguish between the theoretical opening as a means of knowledge production to generate more thought instruments about this current moment and the fact that we have to address both struggles together? Do you see this theoretical opening as being distinct and discrete from the political opening? Please do elaborate.
And maybe I can just add a comment from Wangui about Toro, because it goes in the same direction. Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Prize winner for Peace, articulated this fight against injustice well in relation to the ecosystem of global survival. Her work remains seminal to this moment.
Okay. I see them as this for Christine. I see them as let's just use the usual term, relatively autonomous. I think it's really important to not confuse both, and at the same time to not confuse, but not conflate both, and at the same time to not see them as entirely separate. It's really important both for political efficacy and for theoretical acuity to keep them in some form of dialectical relationship, because we still need to do some serious intellectual work to begin to describe what it is that we are going through. You see, we live in an epoch when we seem to have lost our capacity for description. Our experience is so overwhelming in the midst of a paucity of terms, of vocabulary, we seem to always experience a gap between what we experience and our capacity to decipher it and to interpret it. So the two powers of description and interpretation, we have to recover them, especially subordinated people. Part of what is taken away from them is the capacity for language to describe and to interpret in the sense of making sense of their experience, so that the meaning of the experience they are undergoing is not imposed again on them. And that requires some really imaginative work, itself underpinned, of course, by high moral imagination. So that's how I would answer that question. I was saying that I see a political moment, political opportunity emerging out of what we are going through when we look at the mobilizations that have been taking place of late, the number of people who have been in them, in some places like in France, lots of young people, convergence building up between the Gilets jaunes, for instance, and people claiming for truth and justice for Adama Traoré. We cannot not do something about consolidate those, build those bridges. And in the process, imagine new forms of alliances, call it like that, coalitional politics or whatever you want, but deepen the search for what we share in common. What is it that we might share in common, as opposed to a certain kind of politics of high identity, which was much more interested in difference rather than commonalities. So it seems to me there's something there. I don't know what exactly, but it's possible to explore it. Wangari, yes, Wangari did some really serious work when alive. In fact, she's a pioneer, at least in our continent, on these issues of durability. Let's just call them like that. Durability in the sense that, I mean, the history of, first of all, we are not the only inhabitants of the earth. We share the earth, the planet, with other living beings, living or inanimate beings. Fact that for the planet to be sustainable, to be durable, to last, we will need to share it. But sharing it is one of the conditions of its durability. We'll have to share it not only among humans, but among all who inhabit it, almost in line with the South African Freedom Charter document, which began precisely with the duty to share a space that is small, but which cannot survive, we neither, if sharing does not become the basis for relationality, part of what Peggy called empathy. So it seems to me that we have to recapture in the vast archive of the world figures such as Wangari and many others who understood that, in fact, a stake in the sustainability of the planet is our relationship with all living species. How do we undertake, therefore, politics of life that is entirely different from the politics of suffocation, and which racism has generated and so to say universalized. Those issues are back on the agenda very forcefully.
Yeah, we have a number of questions. Thank you very much from Facebook and YouTube. We cannot raise all. We will promise we forward them, but maybe some questions are centering about the questions. That's basically to both of you. You always describe what is going wrong, but you don't really theorize solutions. What can, for example, the philosophy do to justify the duty of global reparation? But there was another question commenting on, I'm interested, that's by, the first one was by Carlos Corrasi, the second one by our colleague Gerda-Henkel-Preis. I'm interested in your relational perspective on the histories and practices of global distribution of life, death, of the right to breathe. And this is an argument very much in line with Susan Sontag's regarding the pain of others. And in that text, Sontag, in her usual self-reflexive genius, stretches compassion and empathy and to their limits, and claims that in the rampancy of violence brought to our doorsteps by new media technologies, they can be exhausted into a sense of impotency and subsequently indifference. Where do you see the notion of care, responsibility as a step forward, and how far do you think we are seeing that in the current dispensation? And others were asking about the relationship between empathy and solidarity.
I would like to maybe make a space for Peggy to come in once again in what I understand as a conversation.
Okay, I can try. I actually thought that was directly meant for you. Yeah, I mean, I think what I have in our discussion here right now is in order to be able to talk about something global or planetarian, we need to also start to find language about our different positions on this planet and our different embedment of in privilege and the absence of privilege. So the people who are a little bit longer around in Bayreuth knows that this was always a comment from me with regard to the idea or the concept of post-humanism. There is not the same humanity inscribed in all of our bodies, and we need to take that into account. And that's what I'm feeling right now in our discussion, that there is not the same planet. Of course, we are on the same planet, but we are actually in different, we're literally living in different times. As we pointing out that this pandemic and also the global, the climate change and the climate crisis affects all of us. It affects us differently. And for the more harmed, marginalized communities, for the regions which are literally disappearing slowly, step by step, as we speak. It doesn't matter that we might have a global understanding in 20 years, because they won't be around anymore. So as we might be on the same planet, it kills differently, and it puts differently time on us and possibilities on us to actually deal with what we have to deal with that right now. And that's why I'm pushing for that we need to really stop and do this uncomfortable conversation, or get into this uncomfortable conversation, that in order to be able to achieve something like a global understanding of humanity, or a global equality of life before death, we need to address the inequality and the various times we are running out of in our bodies. So that's all what I can say for now.
Yeah, it's a productive tension, I think, and we have to hold both ends together. And I guess we certainly agree on the fact that both ends have to be held simultaneously. Of course, we all breathe, but yes, certainly it's not exactly the same air, depending on ways in which we are exposed to pollution, and see it here in South Africa, for instance, in a city like Johannesburg, where under the earlier dispensation, those who were racialized were relegated to parts of the urban space where they were the most exposed to hazards of life, by which we were therefore referring to the question of the unequal redistribution of death, and we have to hold on to that side all the more, because if we don't, then the possibility of justice, which is really part of what is at stake finally in this, won't become actualized. The other question, I can't remember what it had to do with questions of care. Yes, questions of care, but also questions of repair, which is not exactly the same thing as reparation. But in reparation, of course, we have the first step, which is to repair that which has been broken. I travel a lot in the continent, and it strikes me that everywhere I go, in every major city, when you land in Abidjan, in Lagos, in Dakar, part of what is striking, first of all, people are always doing something. They are working, they're sitting, talking, but more importantly, they are repairing something. I don't think that we we have paid much attention to those practices of repair. And I'm just wondering to what extent it is possible to connect them to the problematic of care that is at the core of this conference.
Yeah, thank you very much. There were also other things that are related, and particularly the expression of gratitude, to say that indeed, often racism creates an atmosphere that ceases to be possible to be expressed by language. And there is trauma, and racism is an ongoing trauma, and that it's so difficult to find words to talk about it. So participants, thank the two of you for expressing this and for finding words to talk about it. And I also think that is a very beautiful note of where I could come in and be very grateful and thank both of you for sharing these very rich moments and thoughts with all of us. And I'm very grateful because in this very moment, as Peggy was stressing, change is happening. And my dear colleague Christine Vogt-William keeps stressing that too. And I think we used that window today. And thank you to all participants to making that possible, of making a point in this window. Thank you very much. And of course, tomorrow the festival is ongoing with great speeches and readings. But now we also have a concert. And in order to announce it, I pass the word on to Collade and Maximilian. And thanks again, everyone.
Yeah.
Hi, Max. Hi.
Hi, Collade. Hi. Hello, people. Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, just a short introduction. My name is Max. I'm doing community radio in Halle. And yeah, after all these thoughts, opinions, discussions, and singings, and also poems, to end this first day of this year's online edition of the festival, I'd like to quote one of my favorite musicians from Detroit. His name is Moody Man, and he once said in an interview, why he's not doing that many interviews, let the music do the talking. And therefore we invited various musicians to play for us online. Yeah, Collade, maybe you would like to introduce the first artist who is performing for us.
All right, thank you, Max. Before we talk about the first artist, I want to have a rundown of the artists we have tonight. Tonight, we're going to have Bless coming up all the way from just here in the neighborhood in Amsterdam. And then we're going to go all the way also to Spain and travel down to Mozambique. And then we'll come back to America, Dr. Reeds. But we'll start off with Bless. I was chance to meet Bless for the first time last year in the Big Sass festival. It was not digital. This is the first time it's digital. And he did some raps and some songs. And I felt the energy of his music. He's a songwriter, is a poet also. And presently told me today that he's working on a what they call horror film. And I think he's also going to be around to join us a little bit to talk about his stuff. Are you there? Blessed?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, come on, bro. The floor is yours. Yep.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Everyone can hear you, Blessed.
Yeah, I hear you, Bless.
Good to see you guys again.
Wow, what a setup. That's a nice room.
Setup. I also have some really loud bass to hear your raps, bro.
Great to be back. Thank you for having me again, Big Sus. See some familiar faces. Susan, Catherine,
Hey.
Voice. Wow.
Hey, welcome.
Mr. Reed in there, yeah, really cool. Evie, of course. Chemo, yes. Omek in the house.
Oh,
Yeah.
Black, make it happen.
Yeah.
So, as Max and Colada said, I'm from Amsterdam, born and raised, based here also. I'm right here in my studio, Burgundy Sound Studio. And yeah, I think for me and all of you, it's been a weird year. For me especially, no music lively actually. So this is actually a great opportunity to share music and to still see some lovely faces here on the screen. I'm a spoken word artist, MC, and as Colada said, I'm working on a horror movie, but that's more of my producer, sound design gig I've got going on. What I'm gonna do for you tonight, because you've been working hard, listening hard, and talking hard the whole day. I will start up with a spoken word piece and then move into some of my newer music. This is my third time on the Big Sus Festival. I'm really happy to be back again. Hopefully next year I'll be back in Bayreuth. But this first piece I wrote this March, and it's about my state of mind and the world state during the social distancing and everything locking down. I made it into a song at a later point, but I want to share it with you in the original form first. So, it's called Wonderful. Early morning, time frame of the prior mentioned. Journey to the grocery store like I am legend. Almost no people on the street, still feeling great. Social distancing seems hard, introverts can't relate. At least on social media, they say. The same conversations, filled with misinformation. Don't have all the facts, but can't resist the temptation. Since gossip slowed down, many miss a sensation. Not a lockdown yet, but it ain't a vacation. With Italy minus 10 days, hope you see the relation. But now, uncertainty across the nations. Check your virtues, check your patience. People clap at night for overworked workers in healthcare. Same people hoard teepee during the day and go out to busy spots. Oh, hypocrisy, you left us not. Sipping this tea while it's hot. So much whining, so many complaints, and this ain't even the worst picture that life can paint. With kids growing up in Aleppo, refugees crossing seas desperate to be free. Slavery in Libya to the Middle East. War-torn countries never knowing peace. So please, tell me again how you can't stay home. Tiny violins playing tones. People disappoint on a daily basis. Wish I could sit out the end of times in cryogenic stasis and wake up to an era of mankind that's elevated, only to find it overrated. Not everything here is wonderful. Thank you. So I just had to check. I did a sound check yesterday with my man Colada already.
Yep.
But not to mess it up, of course, because this all these technical things. Normally you do everything there, Max and Colada. I have to do it on my own.
I got you covered from here. Don't worry.
Oh yes, definitely. So, with that being said, I want to move on to my music of this year. Brand new, got a few surprises, a few beats off a local gifted beat maker. I'll introduce him a bit later. I see him in the room also. But yeah, before this all started, I was working on an album named Blessed Season, and the idea was to drop music every month. And around this time, I would re-release the music, remixed, and have an album. But since there's no live shows going on right now, I just keep on making music. So I know I don't have too much time, so we're just gonna run to the music. This first one is produced by a local Bayreuth beatmaker, a young talented kid called Little Beats. I'm working on him like with more things. And this first track is the title track of the album, featuring Kelvin Chan from New York. I hope the speakers won't pop, but here we go. Season. Oh, that was good. Max, looking at you.
New beats.
Back with many, dropping season 2020. Catch my vibe, a little beats, rhymes, I have plenty. It's been a while, been around, cross country, many towns. Mad love, people like the sound, still getting down. Left the office, move different now. Went from dream chasing to reality making, fastly chasing. They said it was a bold move. I said you might be right, but I gotta do what feels good. Corporate slaving, staying far away from that mood. Did it, done it half the decade to watch me elude. Let my wife was in my locker, guess I'm back sounding rude. Being down, afro up, no bless that dude. Catch me on the stage, overseeing that move. Unknown to many, but more recruit. Word up the community, burgundy suits. Evie in my corner, guess life's so good. This season, this season, this season, this season, this season. This is blessed season. It's been a while, but I'm not leaving. Counting down, look, I'm in even. This is blessed season. Dropping tracks on tracks on tracks. In 2020, watch me bringing it back.
Blessed season, it's been a while but I'm not leaving. Counting down to count me in even. This is blessed season, dropping tracks and tracks and tracks. In 2020, man, I'm back.
Losing BUC was like losing family. Although it was a long time coming, the impact wasn't nothing. Came too far to be stopping, so it's all bets I'm blessed. Let's get dropping. Done being overlooked by locals while I'm outstanding. More love abroad gets me out landing. Alliance has been made. Witness my demanding. The stage is not a modest place, so I stop pretending life humbled me down in the level like a fountain's receipt. Claim my body back, rock from under my feet. Mentally strong while I'm breathing, there is no defeat. Was born and rose, back to murk another beat. I walk the walk, not too much talk on the side. In love with the process, built with those who abide. Good ain't good enough, greatness ain't overnight. A born lover, but you best to know I can fight.
Blessed season, blessed season, blessed season, blessed season, this is blessed season. It's been a while, but I'm not leaving. Counting down to count me in even. This is blessed season. Dropping tracks and tracks and tracks. In 2020, watch me bringing it back. Blessed season. It's been a while, but I'm not leaving. Counting down to count me in even. This is blessed season. Dropping tracks and tracks and tracks. In 2020, man, I'm back.
Wow, this is blessed season.
Yeah, big up to Kelvin Chan.
Tracks, bro. That was good. And just before, are you doing just one more track for us, or you still have one or two more? What do you have more for us?
I still got, I think, 7 minutes wrapped up for you guys.
Okay, just before you do that, I want to remind our listeners and viewers that Blessed won the Dutch final of the Emergence in 2017 and went on to compete on the world stage here in Germany, and is also what we call part of the BUC. Can you just talk about the BUC a little bit of what you're doing and give us this track to end up?